On est très bien. Et encore, ça va commencer dans une minute.
He might have turned it off. There you go, Josh. For sure.
I got Kiev down.
Kiev, a lot of
But, you know, to be Kiev, but we're back, it's back in Russian control.
Have we talked about genocide and where that term came from at all? It came from someone who wrote the where everyone has moved to, and I can't remember his name, but anyway, I just didn't know if that was
I
something.
don't know if you had it.
No.
It hasn't come up in mine, but. So we will be now housing.
No, and I just was curious if you had talked at all about that, but.
I mean, genocide, yes, not the source of the term.
Right. I think it was during the Nuremberg trials that term was, one of the lawyers, his name, but anyway, just curious.
Let's see how long it holds out.
What I got from, I then did Washington Post.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this timely discussion of the crisis in Ukraine. First off, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and they'll give a brief introduction on their expertise in the area, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. All right. First off, our Vice Chancellor and Provost for Academic Affairs, Dr. Cavalier.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. My connection to Ukraine is my family and I lived in Kiev for 10 months in 2005-06. I did a Fulbright and taught at 2 universities there, and it was a remarkable experience for all of us. And I have a particular angle that I want to talk about, and hopefully y'all will have some insights about this. There's a tremendous amount to discuss. A lot of the conversation lately has been around creating a humanitarian corridor out of Kiev and Mariupol and Sumy, and there are a few other places, and how that has not been, at least from what we've been told, has not been observed and honored by Russia yet. So I wanted to just read you a very brief first-person account of running from the Russian troops, and this is the experience this reporter had. We're lying on withered grass. There are too many of us, hundreds, and there are not enough amenities for everyone. We are the people caught in the bombing. The city is behind us. We run as a herd from the war and its battles. When the time comes and you have to hit the ground face down, assume a fetal position, trying to hide your head, knees, and even your elbows under your body. When the diving helicopters hover over your bent back, the ground starts to resemble a deathbed. Here are the helicopters going for another round. They fly so low that you can see the gunners' hands and faces. Some say that they can even see their eyes. But this is fear talking. The main thing is their legs dangling carelessly in the open hatches, as if they didn't come to kill, but to let their tired feet get some fresh air. Their feet are big and scary, and the soles almost seem to touch our faces. The barrels of their guns are squeezed between their thighs. We're frightened, but we all want to see our killers. They seem to be laughing at us, crawling comically down below, heavy old women, young girls, and children. We can even hear their laughter. But no, this is just another illusion. It's too noisy to hear that. Automatic weapon fire whistles in the air around us, and someone always starts to wail along. Has anyone been killed, wounded? So, that account, I think probably lots of the million or so folks, it's more now, who have been trying to get out and have been fired on, understand that experience. That was written by a reporter named Anna Polkovsky. Does anybody know who Anna Polkovsky is? Well, first of all, she was killed in, 2008. So this is not about Ukraine. This is from a book called A Small Corner of Hell, Dispatches from Chechnya. This was written in 1999. And so the reason I read this is because I want to say that what is happening now is exponentially more extreme. But this is not a new way of behaving for Vladimir Putin. And certainly Chechnya showed that. The world doesn't know very much about that second war in Chechnya. This is when he was prime minister. And I think what we're seeing now is this playing out at a much larger scale, but I don't think any of us should expect that the result or the outcome will be different, or that there will be a desire to honor people's lives. The other part of that is, this, in my mind, is a continuation of 2014 Maidan. For a very long time, he tried to control Ukraine through Viktor Yanukovych. We can say more about him later, who fled the country into Russia during Maidan. But that didn't work, and Ukrainians stood for their rights and pushed back in their desire to be part of the European Union. And I think this is just the next more extreme step to try and accomplish what he tried to do with the puppet government under his control. So we can talk more about that.
I guess I'll just introduce myself. It'll be easier. I am Dr. Shara Van Horn, and I am an associate professor in the Department of Mass Media and Strategic Communication. My area of expertise is really along the persuasion lines. I'm a rhetorician by training, and this semester I happen to be teaching a class on propaganda. So as much as I hate to say it, it's a wonderful case study for my student, albeit very tragic. So I'm going to talk mostly about Russian propaganda, at least at the moment. And there are certain things that you have to understand about Russia at this very moment. Virtually all outside sources of information have been completely cut off. So there is a closed media system in Russia right now. And anybody who knows anything about tactical warfare, the first thing that you want to do is control communication. Because if you can control communication, you can control the narrative. And Russia is particularly good at controlling the narrative. They have scripts that they have sent to the schools that are detailing what Russia is doing, which of course is not what Russia is doing, but it's what they're saying they're doing. For instance, they are saying that they are conducting a special peacekeeping mission, the goal of which is to contain the nationalists who are oppressing the Russian-speaking population. They called the Ukrainian fascists Ukro-Nazis and accused them of a genocide, specifically the Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And this is straight out of World War II propaganda, because they are providing the Russian people a common enemy. And that common enemy is not Ukrainians, by the way. That common enemy is the United States. So the Ukrainians are not bad. They're just stupid and brainwashed by NATO and the fascist imperialists who want Russia to be a colony exploited by the West, specifically the United States. Mariupol is a concentration camp. This is, of course, where we have a horrible refugee crisis, as Dr. Cavalier was just talking about, but the Russians are calling it a concentration camp. The Ukrainian troops are herding civilians to a factory in Mariupol planted with explosives to blow up if city defenses are breached for video footage. That is what they are saying the Ukrainians are doing in Russia right now. In Russia, they believe that they are rounding up Ukrainian civilians, putting them in a factory, and then threatening to bomb the factory or to detonate it if the perimeter is breached. So they're also making the claims that the West is banning free speech, that the Russians don't really need SWIFT, which is, of course, the international banking, that the sanctions only mean that the oil prices in the West will go up, not in Russia. So this closed media system is very effective, and it's very effective because the Russian people, who are largely old, by the way, they have more people over the age of 45 than they do have citizens between the ages of 15 and 45. Most of them, almost all of them, and especially now, get their information from state-run media, specifically television. Very few people get their information from the internet. And even if they do, they don't have access outside of Russia right now. And of course, there are draconian measures being taken about against anybody who is even breathing a word of dissent. So you can be imprisoned up to 15 years for speaking out against the official Russian information out there. It's a cycle that we have seen before. When you unite a people against a common enemy, it makes scapegoating that enemy possible. It makes dehumanizing that enemy possible, and then it makes it possible for people who would normally not have an issue with another people to execute them at large. And that, I think, is the scariest part about this rhetoric. It's not Ukraine. It's not what's going on in Ukraine. It's what comes after, because Ukraine isn't the enemy here, at least not as far as the Russian people are concerned. We are.
All right, Dr. Cavalier, Dr. Van Horn, thank you very much for that. Now joining us via Zoom is Dr. Alice Catherine Carls from the History Department. Dr. Carls?
All right, thank you very much for having me, and I wish I could be with you all, but this is great. To me, the most important aspect of this war on Ukraine is that it has given us a sharp sense of right and wrong that we had lost, I think, in the past years. And echoing what my two colleagues have said about the human element of this tragedy, I want to read a passage this time from someone who is on the front line taking care of the refugees that come from Ukraine. So here is the situation that that person reports. There are a lot of refugees, of course we know that, over 2 million by now, mainly mothers with children, children from orphanages. You don't hear that very often. Did anybody see on CNN that little boy who was 3 years old, was running alone towards a train, I suppose, running, fleeing for his life and crying? He was alone, he had lost his parents or his caretakers, and to me, this is the image of the refugee crisis. Children from orphanages and students. And the caretakers say we have provided accommodations in student dormitories, hotels, sports halls, and private schools. The children are admitted to schools and kindergartens. The people are terrified that they are alive, they have food, clothes, and medical care. And then something very interesting, these refugees are from East Ukraine, and the caretakers are in need of volunteers who speak Ukrainian because the refugees from Eastern Ukraine refuse to speak Russian to the people they come in contact with, their caretakers, who speak Russian. Everybody could speak Russian, but nobody wants to speak Russian. That is extremely telling that in Eastern Ukraine, you have a language that is different from Russian. It is close, but it is different, and the refugees refuse to speak Russian. So this tells lies. And then there is this thing that the caretaker says, that history has come full circle. The world has failed to notice the birth of a tyrant, a new tyrant. We must now, and this is what I want you to remember, we must now be together with the refugees, help each other, and be for them a family, a human family. And as we know, war brings the worst and the best in people. And those caretakers who are on the front lines of the border, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, have a common border with Ukraine, and all those countries are hosting refugees and taking care of them as one big family. And when I read this, I was extremely moved because through my mind ran the image of U.T. Martin. If U.T. Martin were in the same position of having a flood of refugees coming, I know we would open our dorms, we would open our sports venues, we would open our cafeteria to those refugees. And so I sense a great solidarity with those refugees. If I have the time, I'd like to add maybe a little something that came through my mind as, the sense of history. I can bring the word of history. And history repeats itself because in 1919, after the First World War, Eastern Europe was dismantled and new countries were created. It took 14 years of democracy. And then in 1933, Adolf Hitler came into power. From 1936 to 1939, it took him 3 years to dismantle peace and to go through war and invade Poland on September 1st, 1939. Then there is World War II. And maybe few of you know that World War II actually did not end until October 2010, when the final treaty finalizing the borders. That's what peace treaties do. The borders in Europe was signed. It was called the 2+4 Treaty. And immediately thereafter, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed. So we had the same situation where those countries of East Central Europe were free again and could choose democracy. But then, in 2000, you have about 10 years of democracy. And in 2000, in Russia, you have the coming of Vladimir Putin, who for 13 years is kind of controlling the country and so on. But then from 2014 to 2022, we have had a long road to war. And as Dr. Cavalier evoked, Chechnya, Syria, Georgia, again Ukraine, Sister unfolding, and Syria, more tellingly Syria. And so there is a parallel there, and I think we need to be very cautious about that. So that is the weight of history, and thank you. I'm done with my introduction.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Carls, for that. Moving on to our political science department. First off, we have Dr. Carrie Humphries.
Hello, thank you everyone for coming. So my area of expertise is European politics and the politics of the European Union. And so I wanted to speak briefly about the responses that we've seen from the EU, because this is really their second time through. They have done a lot of the same things that they did when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. But everything we're seeing is definitely on a larger scale than what we saw in 2014. So the first go-to response has really been sanctions, particularly Russia, but also Belarus, because they have been supporting and facilitating the Russian operations. The types of sanctions and the level of sanctions are significantly higher. I mean, they're targeting more individuals, and it seems almost every day there's a new story about how they've agreed to increase sanctions. We're going to target more individuals or more exports, and so they also removed Russia and recently Belarus from the SWIFT, the international financial transactions. And so sanctions has and continues to be the EU's primary response. What we've also seen in this current situation is a lot more support. And by support, I mean resources, so money, investments, trying to take care of the refugees, as several of our panelists has mentioned. We've also seen weapons, though, and that's something we didn't see as much in the 2014 situation. And so the support has also been quite high. We're once again seeing the EU try to play a role in calming tensions and trying to diffuse the situation a little bit. This is something that they did previously. There were 2 agreements that both sides, claim the other violated, but Minsk 1 and 2 from the Crimea situation, I'm not sure the EU has a lot of kind of hope and puts a lot of stock in the fact that any deal will be held by parties currently based on previous situations. But nevertheless, the president of France, Macron, has been on the phone with Putin. It probably doesn't hurt that it's also an election year for France. So anything that they can be seen as positively contributing to the situation is definitely, good for them. But there's ongoing dialogue because this is very much in their neighborhood, right? I mean, they don't want to see this get any worse. They very much condemn the situation that has already escalated. We're also seeing the European Union scramble to revamp their energy policy, right? So not only is Ukraine and Russia very much in their neighborhood, but the EU countries are heavily dependent on Russian oil and gas, right? And so their considerations and incentives are very different than, say, the United States. Some of the European countries are upwards of 90% reliant on Russian oil and gas. So your thoughts of, can we boycott all of Russian oil, are very different than what we see in the United States, right? So the US did recently come out and say they're boycotting all Russian oil. Ukraine has called for something similar from the EU, but the EU has not been willing to take that step because that is a major inconvenience and problem for a lot of these countries. So they're a bit scrambling to figure out what to do. So far, their latest attempt is they're hoping by the end of this year, which we're still pretty early in this year, but they're hoping by the end of 2022 to reduce their reliance on Russian oil imports by 2/3, and then hopefully by 2030 eliminate their reliance on Russian oil, but that's a long-term project, and there's a lot that could happen just within the course of the year. So those are some of the things that the EU has done. Now, additional requests that they have received, primarily from Ukraine, is one, a fast-track membership into the EU, right? And that is not really something the EU is equipped to offer. So despite talks and headlines of, fast-track membership, there is no easy in. And so that is not something that the EU can readily offer. Likewise, a no-fly zone is not going to happen because that would more directly involve the states and a lot of NATO members in defensive operations, which supplies great actually defending the airspace of a country that's not in the EU, not in NATO. They're definitely not at that point yet. And as I mentioned, the full oil boycott is also not something that the EU is considering. So definitely a multi-pronged response so far, but definitely also some limitations on what they're willing to do.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Adnan Rasool. I am an assistant professor of political science, and my area of expertise with regards to this conflict I teach the course on war and peace. I also specialize in American foreign policy as well as political economy. And as my fellow panelists have mentioned, we're looking at this from a very holistic point of view. We're looking at this from the perspective of history, politics, communications, as well as lived experiences of how we're dealing with this conflict. What I am offering to this discussion is looking at it from the perspective of the United States, as well as looking at it from a security perspective, as well as a political economy perspective. As my colleague Dr. Humphries mentioned, majority of Europe is dependent heavily on Russian oil and gas. It's not something that has happened very recently. It has been designed to be that way. We heard discussions previously in the last few months about US agreeing to Germany building Nord Stream 2, which is a massive oil pipeline that stretches all the way from north of Russia into Germany, providing more accessibility towards oil and gas. And then this conflict erupting immediately after that. We have already had discussions in the US talking about that US should get off Russian oil, even though we do not import a lot of it to begin with. Our energy sources are very diverse compared to the rest of the world, which is mostly Europe and Africa. Now, in that regard, what is going on in Ukraine at this stage has ramifications which are long-term and do not only impact Europe, they impact all of us in different ways. For instance, for us in the US and North America in general, the gas prices have gone up. This is going to have a knock-on effect. But what it also does is it opens up discussion on the validity of security alliances like NATO. For instance, NATO was the linchpin. The argument, like Dr. Van Horn pointed out as well, the argument being made was NATO is threatening Russia and Ukraine is playing a significant part in that threat towards Russian-speaking populations and Russia in general. So how does an alliance like that survive this? Does it revitalize the alliance after having heard US talk about leaving NATO at a potential point within the last 4 to 5 years? Is it feasible anymore? If it is, do we invest more money there? Where does the American foreign policy stand on all of these things? And then there's a discussion of how effective US foreign policy can be when we can align all our allies over a period of about 10 to 15 days in order to come up with a sanctions package, which is probably the harshest sanctions package that the US and the rest of the world has embargoed on any country since, I would say, Iran many, many years ago. So what we're trying to understand and what we're trying to look at as part of this discussion is how this conflict is playing a role in our daily lives in terms of US foreign policy, as in terms of pocketbook issues, but in the longer run, the validity of alliances and the validity of security operations and so on and so forth. And I look forward to your questions.
Hello, I am Drake Nikita Box, and the reason I tell you my middle name is because it'll explain while I'm up here. I am actually from Donetsk, Ukraine. I was adopted when I was 2 years old by an American family. I am blessed to be here in this country. I love being in America, but I also love being from Ukraine and being Ukrainian even more. What I hope to provide to this panel is kind of a unique perspective as somebody who can speak for the Ukrainian people to a certain extent, because I know I'm not directly being faced with the conflict, but I know my heart and my head is being directly infected by this ruthless and useless aggression shown by Vladimir Putin. The main thing that I wanted to talk about for the Ukrainian people and on our behalf is opportunity. That's all we've ever wanted, is opportunity to be our own nation, to be our own people, to not be overshadowed by the thought of the USSR coming back or the thought of a puppet government being installed and not being able to dictate our own lives and our own livelihoods, and just wanting to be able to live our lives to the best of our ability. And I believe that comes with time, but it also comes with peace. And obviously, in the situation we're in right now, we are not seeing much peace. But that is all Ukraine wants. All the Ukrainian people want to do is to wake up and say, okay, I'm in Ukraine. I'm not in Russia. I am in my own country. I'm in my own land. And I want to be able to vote for who I want to vote for, like us Americans are able to do. And that's the great thing about democracy, is because we have a choice. And Ukraine wants the choice, and that choice for us is opportunity. Like me, I know I'm in America now, but I want the opportunity to go back to my land where I was born, where I was raised, and all the adversity that I went through, like being raised in an orphanage for 2 years, being diagnosed with cerebral palsy, not being able to get treated because Ukraine didn't have the right amenities, didn't know how to diagnose it, being malnourished, kind of forgotten in the back of an orphanage because they thought I was going to die anyway. Obviously, here I am today, and I just think that the Ukrainian people, along with myself, we just want an opportunity to be ourselves and not be dictated by anything that another nation has to say that we should do and how we should act. Also, I believe resiliency is what Ukraine is all about. I was telling Dr. Cavalier over here that I believe that is the main attribute for Ukrainians. And as you're seeing right now, Putin thought he was going to walk into our country and thought it was going to be a 2-day thing, and he was just going to wave his hand and it'll all be over. Obviously, that is not the case. We are defending our nation with all that we have. We appreciate the support that we've gained from Europe, like Poland and America and France, and everybody that's sent us ways to defend ourselves. But we do not want this war. Russians do not want this war. We were talking about Russians speaking oppression. That is not true. The region I'm from is heavily Russian influenced. My parents, my biological parents, are born in Moscow, the capital of Russia, the center of Russia, and yet they never faced oppression. They left Russia to escape oppression into a free nation like Ukraine. We just want to grow. We want our opportunity to be ourselves. We want our opportunity to be truly free, and I will fight for that till my very last breath, just like I know my fellow Ukrainians will as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Humphries and Dr. Rasul, for your expertise, and thank you, Mr. Box, for your heartfelt words. And I think all of us stand in agreement when we say we all stand with the Ukrainian people, and hope that this crisis is resolved very, very soon. Now I would like to open the floor for discussions. Who might have a question? Go ahead.
So my question is, what impact might the personification of President Volodymyr Zelensky as a poster child of democracy in Ukraine and abroad have upon A, the war effort, and B, the future geopolitics of Europe? That's just a general question for the panel.
So far, our live stream, just to make sure that they heard it, the question was, what does President Vladimir Zelensky in the impact that he's had go towards the idea of democracy in Europe? Thank you, Chase. Yeah, so to get it word for word. What impact might the personification of President Vladimir Zelensky as a poster child of democracy in Ukraine and abroad have upon A, the war effort, and B, the future geopolitics of Europe?
Again, going back to the idea of identification, right? Putin has been identified by many up until about 2 weeks ago in this country were valorizing Putin as a strongman, as a great leader. That has since changed. But one of the things that we do see happening with Zelensky is our valorization of him. And he stands as kind of the, well, as you said, the poster child, but it gives not only the Ukrainian people somebody to identify with and to fight for, which is very important, but it gives the West that single person who is uniting many of the different countries associated with NATO, as well as the people within it. I think most of us only knew of Zelensky based on the impeachment trials. Now we can look to him as somebody who is the personification of valor, the personification of courage, and we see a true leader, and it's something that we can all aspire to be. And I think that is important in wartime propaganda. You have to have your heroes. If you don't have your heroes, then you don't have anything to fight for. So that, I can answer that part of the question. I can't answer the next one, though.
I want to mention this also. You know, when he was elected, he was a comedian and a TV personality, and that was a source of a lot of ribbing and humor, jokes, ridicule. But one of the things that he's not is he's not someone who was part of the affluent inner circle of Ukrainian politics and economics and finance. You know, after 2014, when Yanukovych or when he ran away, Poroshenko became the president, and Poroshenko was he made his money on one of the biggest chocolate companies in Ukraine, and he was a billionaire, but he was not that much different than the others who came before him, like Yulia Tymoshenko, who, yes, she was fighting with Yushchenko to try and create more democracy, but she too, whether she was rightly put in jail or not, had strong ties to that inner core that had power through the money that they had. This is someone who's totally different. Now, I'd say one other thing. He's got to live. I mean, and that's hard to imagine right now, I mean, to be honest. But that's, I think, and if he were to survive and Kiev doesn't fall, then there's a possibility of an entirely different kind of leader moving Ukraine closer to the EU.
Yeah, he said what I wanted to say.
I believe somebody that is Ukrainian at heart, what Zelensky has provided us is unity. And when I say unity, Ukraine is a large country. It is the largest country in Europe, excluding Russia, by land, square foot land, okay? So there's obviously a lot of diversity within Ukraine. But what Zelensky has allowed Ukrainians to do is say, okay, this is what a true Ukrainian represents. This is what we want to be. This is what we want our kids to grow up to be, to think like, because not saying he's perfect, but he knows he's human, and he acknowledges his human aspects, but he also acknowledges the fact that he has a lot of responsibility on his shoulders, and he doesn't just say, okay, I'm the president, and these just happen to be my people. No, the people of Ukraine are the people that he wants to run Ukraine. He doesn't want to run Ukraine. He wants the Ukrainian people to dictate how Ukraine is as a country, and I believe that's what Ukraine needs, and I believe he provides that exact opportunity.
All right, thank you very much for those answers, and I hope that answered your question. Sir?
Yeah, I had a question that was kind of inspired by Dr. Carl's statement that, you know, if the same thing were happening near Martin, that we would open our arms and accept refugees and stuff like that, and you'll have to color me very skeptical about that. I'm 100% on Ukraine's side, and I'm really inspired by the way that Poland has accepted and has shown its willingness to accept hundreds of thousands, perhaps even 1 million, who knows, refugees. How did that look 7 years ago when there were 1 million Syrian refugees? And I looked it up, and typical for Eastern Europe, Poland only accepted 1 to 2% of all of Syrian refugee applications. So what's the difference?
So for those that may not have heard it or on the live stream as well, we're looking at the comparison between the Ukrainian refugee crisis and the Syrian refugee crisis from a few years back, where Poland accepted nowhere near the amount of refugees from Syria that are currently now being accepted.
Come on, Carrie.
It's a loaded gun, but sure.
Dr. Carls?
I did not answer that since the question was referred to what I was saying, something that I said. Can everybody hear me?
Try it now.
Oh, okay.
Is it working?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, very good. All right. Yeah, it is true that 7 or 8 years ago, the Syrian refugees crisis, well, that was 2015 actually, overwhelmed Europe. The Germany opened its borders to over 1 million, if I'm not mistaken, 1.5 million people, refugees, Syrian refugees. You have to look at the European Union as a whole. You have to look at the situation of Poland, which is at the border of the Soviet Union, the eastern border. You also have to look at the regimes in Poland at this time, in 2015, and now. As in Hungary, Hungary has a more authoritarian, maybe rightist government and doesn't accept foreigners as readily. So you have this dynamic of the rightist parties taking over in those countries and not opening their borders. Now, what is different? Like in
in Hungary, you have a lot of volunteers. The Hungarians are doing a fantastic job of welcoming refugees, but it is not the state that is doing it, it is the volunteers. In countries like that of East Central Europe that has suffered a great deal, there is always going to be open arms for refugees, and we see that in Poland also. Another reason why perhaps you could say that the Poles are opening their borders to the Ukrainians is that it's in the history of Poland, because Poland had Ukraine in the 16th century, and then Poland and Russia were fighting for it. And until the 18th century, and then Poland lost it in the 19th century and disappeared from the map. And then again in 1919, Poland took a part of Ukraine, the western part of Ukraine, from the Soviet Union. And so you have a lot of ties between Ukrainian and Poles. The two countries have not always seen eye to eye. It's a complicated story, but there is a relationship there. Those are populations that are very close, and you have a lot of friends and relatives, lots of Ukrainians who are friends and relatives in Poland. As they do, by the way, in Romania and Hungary.
I'd like to say something. Human suffering is human suffering. I don't care if you're Ukrainian or Syrian or whatever. Human suffering is pretty similar. And saying that okay, we're going to accept all these people because we share some kind of common history, but we're not going to accept these other people because obviously they have a different religion, I think is on an ethical level indefensible. And the difference that we're talking about here is not a small one at all. And I just want to point that out. I think it's wonderful what Poland's doing, but it looked very, very different 7 years ago, and I'd like to know what was so different about their government 7 years ago.
I understand. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that. I would like for you to have the opportunity to talk to people in Europe who could give you their position and explain to you why they had those reactions and why they treated refugees differently. Because I live here, I don't live over there, and so I don't know exactly what the reasons were. And as we know, there are many reasons that the media do not report about, and that factor into such reactions. I know that's not the answer that you are hoping to hear, but that's the best answer I can give at this point.
Thank you for that, Dr. Carlos. Would any of our other panelists like to add on to the question?
Well, I'm not an expert on Syria, and I certainly take your point. But Ukrainians who are trying to get away from Russians bombing them, that is the place that they can go. I mean, you can't go north because you're surrounded on three sides, well, kind of how you think about it, three sides by Russia, and you can go to Romania. But that was wherever Ukrainians could go, and the relationship matters because the Poles, if they didn't do that, if the Poles had said no, then essentially Ukraine was a container that was completely cut off from the world that would allow Putin to do what he wanted to do. And remember, Poland and Ukraine shared hosting of the Euro 2012 soccer championship they had in both countries. So that relationship is there, but it would be an awfully difficult thing to imagine a country saying, you can't come through here, and you have really no other places that you can go unless you're willing to go over the Carpathians to get into Romania.
So I absolutely agree that one of the biggest differences comes down to religion, right? It's an us versus them sort of thing. And this is very much that Ukrainians are closer to us. So, I mean, I fully admit that that is a huge difference. Also, though, I think timing and length are going to be big factors, right? So thinking back to the refugee crisis, 2015, arms were much more open and welcome early on. And as it continued to happen, wave after wave coming in, there was the fatigue, right? We already took some, somebody else takes some. And with the situation in Ukraine, I fear it could very well go the same way, right? If this crisis continues long term, Poland will be in a very similar situation as Greece was during the refugee crisis, right? I mean, Greece was overwhelmed, and the rest of Europe got to a point where they were like, you know what, you're the first point of entry, good luck with that, Greece. Maybe we can rope Turkey into helping as well, but the longer it goes, the rougher it's going to be for Europe to keep its arms open. And that's true with war in general, right? I mean, support tends to be high initially. As things continue to drag out, support will start to flag. So, the unfortunate reality.
Thank you very much for that. Sir?
I'm Todd Winters. A lot of you know me, but I'm the Dean of College of Agriculture and Applied Sciences. And this is more of a comment, but the panel can also chime in. But one thing that we haven't talked about today is food and agriculture. And there's no doubt that there's just a humanitarian tragedy that's going on right now. But it's not going to end there. And some of you, everybody's putting up sunflowers up on their Facebook pages and stuff now, and that's true. Ukraine is the #1 producer of sunflower and sunflower oil, which is very important to the economy, not only for food, but also for fuel as well. And so that's going to be very, very important. But it's also not very much different than we are here in the Mid-South and Midwest. The same crops are produced. They're one of the top producers of wheat. They call it the breadbasket of Europe. Soybean and corn are also two very big crops. They're in the top 10 in the world in that production. So I don't see the farmers from that area getting to the fields this year. And so that's going to definitely have an impact on food and agriculture. The other thing that you might not realize is Belarus and parts of Russia are also some of the top producers of fertilizer. Well, what do you need to produce good food? Fertilizer. Potash, Belarus is #1 in potash production, which is the potassium that we need for good fruit and vegetable and all our different crops that we do. So the prices of those fertilizers have already been going out the roof because of the supply chain issues that we're having because of the COVID crisis. And we're going to even see that worse. So be prepared to see that when you buy your food at the grocery store as well.
All right, thank you very much for that comment. Let me make my way over here. All right, ma'am.
I just have a tiny question. So, Dr. Humphries, I know you mentioned how that NATO and EU, they're not going to let Ukraine in, especially not when they're in an active, conflict like this. Yet, U.S. and other, European countries are putting, massive sanctions on Russia, which is affecting Russian economy, which is affecting the people more than it's affecting Putin or anybody in charge. So why would they choose not to intervene militarily where this conflict might end sooner, but choose to put sanctions on Russia that's now, affecting the people and not Putin? So I guess that's just my question.
Thank you for that question. And this is the difficult choice that democracies often find themselves in, right? Is that on the one hand, you feel very sympathetic and as Dean Winters mentioned, change your Facebook page, show solidarity for Ukraine, but at the end of the day, are you willing to potentially have, body bags coming home? And that is, in a democracy, a hard sell in a lot of cases. So most governments are often hesitant to take that extra step. You're absolutely right. If they intervened, this would either be over very quickly or escalate very quickly, right? It could go either way. So in thinking about what's the best option, but also thinking long-term political strategy, I'm up for election, re-election in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. sanctions, at least you can sell, we did something, right? Sanctions, we accepted refugees, but actually engaging troops is often a measure that we find states and democracies today much less willing to engage in. And then I'm going to pass it on to you.
Thank you. Thanks for that question, Iman. Like Dr. Humphries pointed out, it's a hard sell. But look at it from a different perspective. There's a cost of going to war. War is never free. So if you were going to intervene in a different country, say for instance if you're NATO, and you're considering the possibility of intervening in the conflict in Ukraine, first off, it's not your responsibility because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. NATO does things for its members. So if, hypothetically, Ukraine was a member of NATO, NATO would have done something. Same goes for the European Union. And for that matter, because Ukraine is not a member of the European Union, even though they've submitted their application, it's a choice that the European Union makes of not making them a member. Even for NATO, that's the cost that you are trying to work with. Now, consider everybody else around the world. Consider the US. Consider any other country that has the viable military strength to go head-to-head in a conflict like that. Can we realistically sell that to our people? No way we cannot. The cost is too high. We are recovering as a whole planet from 2 years of COVID, a pandemic, bad economic status, and we're trying to claw our way back to normality. In such circumstances, it's next to impossible to convince anyone, let alone the majority of the population, that let's go to war because we're trying to liberate people. Sanctions are also at different levels. There are scales of sanctions. Majority of the times when we talk about sanctions, we talk about sanctions, the kind of sanctions we put on Iran or North Korea. We've already sanctioned them so many times, if we throw more sanctions in, it really makes no difference. But for the first time, when we talk about Russian sanctions, these are devastating sanctions. You kick somebody out of the payment system, that means you have to either go on the payment system that the Chinese have built, which is CHIP, or you're kind of left on your own. And like Dr. Winters pointed out, you're talking about countries that are bread baskets. They are influential when it comes to exporting goods and services and products that are going to be necessary in the summer as well as the winter. So if you have a wheat shortage, that means the price of wheat goes through the roof for all of us, because commodity prices work in gross numbers, right? It goes the same way for energy prices. It works for all of us. So we're kind of stuck in a catch-22 situation where there is a certain amount of politics, but then there's a lot of economics related to the cost of doing something. And that cost at this stage, frankly speaking, is too high to convince people to go along with. I hope this helps answer the question.
I think there's also the question of whether Putin is really willing to use a nuke, because he's a madman and he doesn't care, and we know that. And so he has said that if anybody tries to interfere, he will consider that an act of war, and he has not left nuclear weapons off the table. So that's part of the calculus, whether we want it to be or not. Do we go head-to-head with another nuclear power? Well, we do care, right? Like, we do care. He doesn't, and that's another part of the risk assessment.
And that's certainly true, but you know, another thing that's happening right now is that in Chernobyl and in Zhytomyr, is it? Anyway, or Zaporizhia, where they were bombing or shelling the nuclear power plant. In both of those cases, you have apparently workers in those plants who have been basically held hostage and not rotated out, and so they've been working for 3 and 4 and 5 days in a row under Russian military orders, for want of a better way to put it. Chernobyl has had its, they've been taken off the electrical grid. There is a real, that's not to say that right now there's going to be another nuclear incident, but there's a reason why you plan to do those kinds of things. It's not just in your way. So that's the other side of it, is at what point is there an obligation on the part of NATO and Europe and the United States to protect against that kind of nuclear problem? That's not a nuke, but that affects everybody. So
you for that answer from our panelists. Dr. Carls, would you like to add anything to that question?
I did not hear the entire question, so if you could repeat it, I can...
Sure, I can try to add something.
Yeah, it was a question. Aman, would you mind repeating your question in a very brief format? So, Dr. Carls, the question was, why is the rest of the world not intervening militarily, but instead placing sanctions upon the Russian government?
That is a big question. Trying not to look at it as a repeat of what happened before World War II, I would say that, what would I say? I'd like to look at last year, 2021, and what happened in 2021, because I think we tend to forget. We want to send immediate military action and no-fly zone, and those are very worthwhile reactions. But if you look at what happened in 2021, the Biden administration did an enormous, and NATO and the European Union did, and the allies did an enormous amount of work in coordinating their efforts, in providing, I think, over $1 billion in weapons to Ukraine and arming Ukraine, and while at the same time pursuing diplomatic discussions with President Putin to try to resolve the crisis peacefully. We tend to forget that this crisis is nothing new. There have been so many agreements since 2014 that have been signed and broken, and again, more agreements trying to be brokered with President Putin, a little bit, again, reminiscent of what happened with Hitler in 1938, 1939, Hitler making promises and then breaking them. And so the help, the military help from the West has been forthcoming to Ukraine for a whole year. There has been a whole year of discussions. When President Zelensky says he has to talk to Putin, he has to, but the entire European Union is involved in those discussions as well. So I don't know what else can be done at this time. If you look at, again, the progression of the involvement of NATO and the European Union and the United States in this conflict. Also, you have to remember that NATO is on high alert. There are American soldiers who are located in the NATO countries that are at the border with the Soviet Union, and they are ready to act immediately. Something else I was going to say about that, and I lost my train of thought because I was while you were talking, I was still looking at this issue of the Syrian refugees, which has been bothering me a great deal. So if I may stop what I'm saying about the intervention in Ukraine and talk about that. Syrian people speak French. And so they are going to be wanting to come to the western part of Europe, to France, to England, where they speak also English. It's going to be more difficult for them to come into a country that speaks Slavic. And I know for a fact, because I was in France in 2015, and I saw how many Syrian refugees were arriving in France and being given asylum and being helped. So I think, to the gentleman who was asking that question about Syrian refugees, that we need to look country by country to see how many each country in the European Union did take, and have the global picture rather than to say, single Poland out and say, why didn't they take more? And then you look at each country and you look at the factors that, the countries don't act separately in the European Union, they act together. There is a kind of an equilibrium in the policies that they have. So, and now going back to why we're not doing more. I know what I wanted to add. Ukraine. It's Ukraine and in NATO and Ukraine in the European Union. This is a problem that is 32 years old. When the Soviet Union broke broke up in 1991, immediately NATO wanted Ukraine to be in it, and Russia pushed back. Yeltsin pushed back, and Putin has pushed back relentlessly because if you look at where Ukraine is, it is the turning point between Europe and Eurasia, and it is too close to Russia, was too close to the Soviet Union, and so the European Union has been frustrated in its attempt to get Ukraine into NATO, and there has been for 30 years a tradition on the part of both NATO and the European Union to not irritate the situation by not getting Ukraine into NATO. And without the fear of Russia, which is a fear that goes back at least 1 century, and it has not changed from the days of Lenin, it has not changed since the days of Stalin. Without that fear of Russia being encircled and being threatened by NATO, we would not be where we are now. And if President Yeltsin had accepted to get into NATO, and for a while under him in the 1990s, Russia was into the Partnership for Peace program with NATO, which means that there was a dialogue that was possible, the building of a common European house, and Ukraine would not be where it is now, fighting for its freedom and for our freedom, because it is, again, very tragically, like those countries in East Central Europe in 1939, it is between two big blocs, one which is democracy, which is European Union, and the other which is Russia. And those two blocs are, you know, and I know something about a country that's in between two big countries because I come from Alsace, which has historically, for at least 2 centuries, been caught between Germany and France, and we have had invasion and invasion and invasion, and so, you know, it's kind of the same, a little bit the same situation that we're in now, but you have to look at 1 century of history to understand how that works. And if a history is of any help, it helps us understand the current situation, I think, with the weapon situation and, you know, not rushing into with this no-fly zone. Now, personally, if you ask me, I would send my jets immediately, or I would give my jets to the Ukrainians. But, you know, the no-fly zone, again, if you look at it, is a complex thing because it involves transfer of airplanes from one country to another. These are complicated things, and nobody expected that. So it's something that is, I'm sure, being worked on right now, but it cannot happen overnight. And that is something that we hear on the news. Every day we hear a little bit more report about this no-fly zone, and I wish it would come sooner rather than later because the Ukrainian people are suffering tremendously and they are dying. Another thing that I wanted to say, and I promise I'll stop with that, is, you know, when Hitler attacked Poland on September 1st, 1939, it took him 3 weeks, a little over 3 weeks, to defeat Poland despite a heroic effort. And the Poles were outnumbered, they didn't have weapons, the Ukrainians have modern weapons, thank goodness, but the Poles didn't have weapons. And at the end of these 3 weeks, Hitler destroyed Warsaw, he carpet-bombed Warsaw, and I don't remember if it's 60% or 80% already at that time. Warsaw was a condemned city. By the end of September 1939, it was a city that, you know, and when we see the same carpet bombing, it's horrific in Ukraine, and we want to say, well, why aren't we doing more? I agree. But there is so much more that is, you know, that we do not know of all the efforts that are being done by the American military, NATO commanders, and I'm sure that they are doing everything that they can to help Ukraine in many ways that we don't even maybe begin to realize because we are not within the classified information group. We are not privy to those decisions that are being made. I don't know if that helps, but.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Carls.
I would like to say, following my nation's history and following the news day in and day out, I realize as a Ukrainian, we are kind of throughout our history, we're caught in the crossfire of diplomatic war between the USSR and what is now Russia, Vladimir Putin's Russia, and the West and the rest of Europe. But we also say we did not choose to be where we are geographically. We are where we are because that is how the boundaries were drawn. But we also know that the fear of inclusion, direct inclusion in conflict with Russia is a serious one, and we understand that. We just want the most assistance that we can get, whether that's weapons or defense mechanisms. I just believe that the Ukrainian people, we hear you, we understand that y'all don't want to get directly involved in fear of nuclear war, but we also hear you when you say we fight for democracy. A lot of countries in the world and in Europe claim to fight for democracy, and I realize you can do that in many different ways. As Ukrainians and as myself, I ask you just to do the most you can, give your max effort, because we are trying to save a nation, we're trying to save a people, and we're trying to save democracy itself.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Box. We'll go over here first, and then we'll come back over here.
Hi, my name is Adrian. Good to see you again. I have one question about Russia, China, and India, and the global, setting of all that. That I think that is very interesting to see how it develops. China and India, even though they are supporting peace talks and everything, they're still supporting economically Russia with, products and everything. So how will that develop? That's the interesting question to me. And if they continue to do that, with both being nuclear powers, will there be sanctions on those countries as well? Or because that will affect the global economy like big time. So just curious.
That's all you. Yeah, that's all you.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks for that question. You're very right. Within the last few years, a decade or so, there has been a realignment in the system. I'll start with India because it's in a very complicated position right now. India is a member of the Quad, where it ties up with Australia, Japan, and the United States to kind of build an alliance to counter China in Southeast Asia and Asia. But at the same time, India is in the middle. It literally is the middle of BRICS. The BRICS countries, including Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So the Indian interests are aligned in all kinds of different directions. That is why India is in such a complicated position. Even at the United Nations, their vote was to abstain from doing anything about Russian aggression and Russian invasion of Ukraine, because for them, the cost of going in either direction is too high. And secondly, majority of the times when you're making foreign policy decisions, as a country like India, you're talking about every seventh person on the face of this earth is an Indian. And when you have that level of influence in the world, not just in terms of people, but in terms of the size of your population, your economy, you have a sense of responsibility, which is you look after your own people first, you look after your business interests first. If your technology, your military, Indian military has exclusively used Russian technology since the beginning. Their military forces use MiGs and Sukhois, which are Russian aircraft. But at the same time, they're competing with China. China happens to be a member of SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Council. But at the same time, China has very close-knit relationships with Russia. China has been bankrolling Russian infrastructure projects for years at this stage. China also happens to be one of the largest suppliers for Russian economy in terms of raw materials as well as finished goods, just like they are suppliers for the US. The Chinese perspective on all of this is China sees an opening. China sees an opening for themselves within the next many, many years if Russia is going to become dependent economically on a Chinese system for payments to begin with. Number two, has to rely on China because nobody else would lend them the money in order to run their economy. And if Russian companies are forced to park their money in Chinese banks over anywhere else in the world, then you have an opening within the Russian economy and within Russian politics for a certain amount of Chinese influence that has never existed before. China gets to have essentially an open run on whatever Russian technology or whatever Russian assets are left by the time Russia is out of this quagmire. So if you're India, you're looking at this and you're concerned about how you're going to ally yourself to manage the US as well as Russia. But if you're China, you're essentially waiting this out, not doing anything detrimental because you're about to have a free run at pretty much any asset the Russian government or any organization the Russian government is going to have. And it's not something that we're talking in terms of a year, 2 or 3 or 4. We're talking 10, 15, 20 years, which in turn creates a bigger security crisis for us. If China is going to expand in that direction and have influence, indirectly, that becomes a security problem for us. The point being, we're discussing Ukraine suffering from a Russian invasion, but if you zoom out of that situation and kind of look at the larger picture, as your question was, we are looking at something that we are going to have to come back as Americans and deal with as part of our foreign policy, because we have no plan for that right now. We never thought that would happen. This was never going to be a clear run for China through SCO at Russian options. Now we have to think about these things. We have to reorient ourselves, and we can't punish India because A, they're very close partners with us, and they're doing diplomatically what they're supposed to be doing. What else? I thought I spoke. Yes, ma'am.
I think I'd like to show a map, if that's okay.
Unless somebody else wants to say something?
No, you can go on ahead, Dr. Carls.
All right. Hang on. I have to share screen first. Okay. As my students know, this is a tricky operation, but there we go. Okay. Can you see the map?
Yes, we can see it, Dr. Carls.
The map I'm showing you is a map of the trade routes, and this is building on what Dr. Adnan was saying about the role of China. For the past 30 years, the European Union has launched a southern Silk Road, inland Silk Road, to get a direct connection between Rotterdam, right here in the Netherlands, and China. And right now, this train connection takes 14 days. It's going very well. And China has done a very big business with this southern route, inland route of the European Union. There is also the old Maritime Route that is more or less controlled by the European Union countries and also the United States. This is the old route of oil, or still the route of oil, etc., through the Suez Canal, etc., etc. This route, and I don't know if you can see it, but it comes through Istanbul and then it goes straight through Ukraine, somewhere in Novorossiysk, somewhere between Crimea, Odessa, and the western border of Ukraine, and then it runs through Ukraine. At least one of the pipelines, natural gas and oil pipelines, does. Okay. And then since Vladimir Putin came into power in 2000, he has tried to take some of that trade away from the southern route, and he has created a northern route that goes through Kazakhstan, goes to Moscow, goes to St. Petersburg. And this is very important because from there he has access to the Baltic Sea, and this is where he can continue his pipeline, the Nord Stream 2, all the way to Greifswald in Germany. Okay, so that is the first northern route, which has mostly a Russian-Chinese component. The Russians are starting a third route that would go farther north, and that would control all of the trade and possibly dominate the trade and monopolize the trade between China and Europe by going entirely through Russia. This is the trace of the old Trans-Siberian Railroad. Now, the new frontier, and this is why Ukraine is so important, because the Russians want to cut off the European Union from this route of trade. They want to push the whole trade of the European Union south to the southern hemisphere. This new route, this new proposed route, this is China that has proposed it, goes from China all the way through the Bering Straits and through the Arctic Ocean. And guess who controls this part of the Arctic Ocean? Of course, it's entirely Russia. And Vladimir Putin, in destabilizing Ukraine, has as a goal to cut the European Union off from this Silk Road, which is the global route of the 21st century. And his intent is to control every bit of trade, every boat that comes through the Arctic Ocean and takes this route right there. So I think, when we see China abstaining from condemning Russia but not voting to condemn Russia, China does equal business with Russia and with the European Union in terms of trade. And so it is right now on the fence on these issues. And it's going to be very interesting to see how the whole thing turns out. But I wanted to add something to Ukraine being at the center of being at the center of this whole Silk Road that comes right here and comes through Constantinople, goes through the Black Sea, and then goes to Vienna and to the heart of Europe, but through a southern route. And there's so much more to know about the Silk Road of the 21st century, but this makes Ukraine even more, a prize, a geopolitical prize between Russia and the European Union. So thank you for listening, and I'm done with my maps.
Thank you, Dr. Carls. Anybody else? Did you still have a question? Yes.
Thank you. I've been working with the U.S. Department of State as English Language Fellow with Russian University. So it's important to think about the Putin regime and the Russian people, because I would say there's a big percentage of people that are dissenting, but because they can't talk about it. Like, we can't talk about it with them. So just keep that in mind as well. I mean, don't hate on Russians, because they are people as well, and it's the Putin regime that is quite minority as that goes. That's not my question, though. So Putin has multiple layers of security and people around him that just say yes. So my question is, some Russian experts have noted that the suspension of operations such as Apple, McDonald's, not just American companies, but IKEA and other international companies as well, embolden Putin and his regime. Do you think these suspensions are making any impact on the Putin regime, or is it speeding up the game for Russia to become more isolationist? Because Putin did say the biggest geopolitical mistake was the breaking up of the USSR. So what's your opinion?
Does anyone want to take this?
I mean, you're the political economist.
Thank you. That's a very valid question. One of the most complicated things is it could go one of two ways. With any of these circumstances, when you shut down an economy or when you close it off, there are always two options. One option is you are going to basically export substitute everything that you have and indigenize your economy as quickly as humanly possible. The problem is normally when somebody does that, they have 10 to 15 years of planning before doing that, and you've got things in place and you've got supply lines already sorted out. Problem is, Putin government never planned this out for 10 years. They kind of fell back into it, and now they are here, so they're trying to figure out exactly what to do. The problem is, and I'll go back to my earlier answer, there's going to come a time where when you're completely cut off from the global economy after having been globalized at such a rapid rate within the last 22 years, and you're suddenly cut off from that economy, majority of your supply chains are still global. So the problem is, even if you started indigenizing things, as in making them yourselves right now, you're still going to hit a brick wall. And what's going to happen is you're going to have a lot of internal dissent. You're going to have people who are frustrated. You're going to have people who are going to have flashbacks of early 90s when you were going through perestroika and you were suffering and there was nothing available. So people are going to start having those flashbacks. So everything Putin has technically done within the last 22 years to gain the glory of what he thought the Russian Empire to be is going to go down the drain because Russia is going to get cut off. You can cover this up with domestic propaganda, and Dr. Van Horn can go into more details of that. But there are limits to that. At a point of time, you're going to be forced to open up. The problem is when nobody else wants to do business with you, the only option is the people who are willing to do business with you, China, which means you have no leverage in the market anymore, so you have to kind of sign on the dotted line. At that point of time, the terms of trade are not determined by the market. The terms of trade are determined by the person who's willing to trade with you, which is one country. And that puts, if you look at this in the longer run, that puts Russia at the Russian people at a disadvantage because they're going to be stuck between oligarchs on one side, a very defeated Putin on one side, and a Chinese juggernaut of an economy willing to take over whatever is left over after they're done with this conflict.
I was just going to quickly add that this also presents two options as well for the people. Because on the one hand, as they continue to lose access to a lot of the goods and services that they have enjoyed, this could lead to more and more dissent and kind of a rise up against Putin. On the other hand, it could also provide ample opportunity to reinforce that the West is the enemy, right? Look at the West. They're refusing to offer you services. And so it could also bolster Putin's regime in that way. And I think it's too soon to say which way it's going to go, but that's something to also consider.
Honestly, mine would be what Carrie was going to say, that, you know, right now, we're the enemy, it's our fault. 60% of Russians, at least from some of the polls we were able to get out prior to the big lockdown of media, believe that the United States in particular is at fault for the conflict in Ukraine. And even going back to what you were saying about China, this reminds me of It's a Wonderful Life. I know it's a very strange analogy, but when all the banks are closing and everybody's doing the runs on the bank, there's the line, Potter isn't selling, Potter is buying. That's what China's doing. China's buying, and they're buying Russia. And that should scare the heck out of all of us.
I would like to emphasize the importance of speaking out. Obviously, that's why I'm here today, because I believe when good people do nothing, bad things happen. So it is also very important, and this is going to sound crazy coming from me, I defend the Russian people, okay? I understand that even though some Russians might hate Putin and everything he stands for, they are not at liberty to say that like we are. Okay, that is one of the great freedoms that Americans can enjoy, and we should be able to enjoy it as a true democracy. But also, we should not villainize the Russian citizenship as a whole, because all of Russia does not stand with Putin. Even though the polls say 60%, it is also crucial to remember that people have their own trains of thought. They are not robots. So just understand that the Russian businesses here in America do not support Putin, and we should not villainize all of Russian because of what Putin is doing. And that's why I believe the sanctions on Putin's oligarchs are vital to this war in Ukraine, because if you really want to hurt Putin, hurt the people around him, because that's the only people he cares about right now is the people around him. It's obvious he does not care about his own people. Otherwise, he would pull out, because the Russians and Ukrainians are mixed together. Like I said before, my family is Russian, okay? My great-grandfather was a World War II fighter pilot for Russia. So I have no quorums with Russia. I have quorums with Putin, as many Russians probably do as well. So I just think it's important for the U.S. government to realize not to deplete the Russian people of basic quality of life, of a good quality of life, but to attack Putin head on, and that's through his oligarchs and his inner circle. And that's why I believe the sanctions and the seizure of assets is something that should be ramped up by America and other European nations. And that's where I believe the most impact will be felt by Putin, and this war will be concluded.
Thank you very much for those answers. I know you've had your hand up for quite a while here.
Thanks. The Pandora Papers released in 2021 showed that Ukraine had the highest amount of political corruption and offshore money havens, specifically naming President Zelensky as one of the politicians. Do you believe that this has had an influence or impact on how the world and other governments view this crisis?
That's all me? That's me? They're all point.
I honestly don't know how to answer that question because I know that Zelensky's popularity was waning up until this happened. And there was, or has been, the speculation that he was involved in corruption himself, because it's very hard in Ukraine to work within a corrupt system without yourself becoming corrupt. That's just, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. I would imagine the same thing would be said of a corrupt system. It's very hard to manage a corrupt system without having that influence put upon you. I will say, however, that regardless of that, at this moment, that is not playing into the calculus. It will come back and haunt him, I'm sure, later on. But at this moment, that's not part of the conversation at all. So had this conflict not happened, we'd still be hearing about that. I know that's a kind of a non-answer. Right. I mean, we don't know how it's going. We don't know how it's going to land. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. Right now, that's not part of the conversation.
She's got a question back there. She's had one for quite a while.
Hi. So this may be maybe a naive or premature question, especially this is the beginning of the crisis, but is there really any way that individually or as a group we can help Ukraine from America? Because my mom, she's from St. Petersburg herself, and my biological grandfather is from Ukraine. So the past few weeks have been very difficult for my family especially, and we weren't really satisfied with President Biden's response, not just the sanctions, but he gave an escape route to Zelensky, leaving his own people during this crisis. So I guess I'm just asking, is there any way we can help from America in this standpoint, as?
That's a great question. I believe, obviously, there are many charities and, organizations that are being started up and have converted to help Ukraine in the humanitarian crisis, also with the Army SOS, which is a fund that I have personally contributed to help the military itself. If you want to contact or get in touch with me, I can help you directly. But also, I would like to say, just do some research. And I'm not saying that in a rude way. I'm just saying, go online, search ways to help Ukraine, and I'm sure plenty of organizations will come up. Just make sure they're verified, because there are the low-life people out there who will start false organizations in the pretense of helping a nation in crisis just to launder you out of money. So just make sure it's verified, and I believe the best way to help is to pray. And I know not everybody shares the same religion, but I must say this as a faithful man. I believe prayer works. Also, anything that you can do to spread the word, because as she understands, propaganda is a main issue in this war. The disinformation spread across Ukraine and across the entire world has been vast. So just check your sources twice, 3 times, 4 times, like you're a journalist, and just make sure that you do everything you can to research and find organizations that you feel fit what you want to do to help. And I would just like to say from a Ukrainian, thank you very much.
Dr. Carls, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Send me an email. My email is accarls@utm.edu, and I will give you a list of reliable institutions that do send the money to Ukraine where it is needed, not Ukraine, to the refugee centers where it is the most needed right now, especially for women and children. The plight of the children, to me, is the one that I get out of my mind. It is really, really a whole generation of little ones. They are little ones. They can barely walk, and they are torn away from their country. So yes, send me an email. I'd be glad to help you find an organization. And then there was something else that you said about helping. Fighting disinformation is important, and I go back to what I said at the beginning. This crisis has made us face some choices. Your generation, the young people who are there, and my generation, all the generations, but the young, our students, you're faced with a choice of whether to believe the facts, whether to believe the truth, or whether to believe disinformation. And this war in Ukraine for us is a wake-up call of consciousness, and it's very, very important. It's a historic moment. It's a very difficult moment, but it makes us face some choices and ask some very, very important questions. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carls. We have time for one more question. Does anybody have one more?
Okay, so there's a bit of a lead up to my question. I think knowing why it started will do a lot to help us figure out how to end it. There are all these reasons why Ukrainian and Russian experts assume Putin would never in his right mind start this war. It looks like it does not have the real logistics or economic or social stability to extend this war the way he wants to, and he massively underestimated Ukraine's willingness to fight back. Some say he's gone insane, some think it's a genuine attempt to fully annex Ukraine, and some say he believes his own bluster about the American Nazis in Donbass. So in your professional opinion, why did Putin start this war, and what is his actual goal going forward?
I'll start, but I can only tell you what I've read.
I can only tell you what I've read. I think, first of all, it's important to understand the Russian propaganda model, which is called the Russian fire hose of falsehood. So they send out, no, seriously, the RAND Corporation came up with the name, not me. But they send out so much misinformation about everything that you don't know what's truthful, you don't know what's fiction, you have no idea, because there's just so much of it. Everything that I have read from people like Anne Applebaum, who is a Russian expert, they all have made the claim that he is really trying to return Russia to its former USSR glory. And if that's the case, then he's not going to stop with Ukraine. Now, none of us can speak for Putin. So we can only go on what the experts are saying. And Applebaum is a pretty good expert. But I mean, that's all I can say on it, other than there's just so much misinformation. Who wants to go first?
Yes, of course. The old, as I showed you, the republics, the countries that are on the western border of Ukraine, of Russia, he wants those, but it is much broader. If you look at how he has been threatening Sweden and Norway for now at least 10 years with sending aerial jets over those two countries and forcing them to up their budget, increase their defense budgets. And again, remember the Arctic Circle. But 10, 12 years ago, Vladimir Putin sent one of his divers under Antarctica to put a time capsule there to claim a part of Antarctica. He wants to control the northern routes because with global warming, he knows this is the shortest route from Europe to Asia, and this is what he wants. He's way beyond wanting to just recreate the old Russian Empire. That is part of his game, but he wants to intimidate countries and really prevent the European Union and even the Scandinavian countries from he wants to throttle their ability to travel and to trade around the world. So this dimension of being able to freely travel around the world is a big component, big issue in this whole game that he's playing. That's my point of view.
Thank you, Dr. Carlos.
I think an interesting part of your question also ties into timing, right? Why now? And I think we've often seen Russia act when it is most fearful that Ukraine is leaning towards the West, right? The whole events leading up to the annexation of Crimea were when Ukraine was leaning like we're going to sign a deal with the EU, and that immediately raises a lot of fear that the EU is going to be right up next to us, right? I mean, Russia has long liked having a buffer, and so that has been a significant part of it as well, right? I mean, Zelensky, as was mentioned, is not one of the traditional oligarchs, was not easily to put under the thumb of Putin, leaning towards the EU, and there always seems to be consequences and reactions in response to that.
All of these things are very true. We cannot predict a lot of these things, but theoretically speaking, there are two reasons you go to war. It's either greed or grievance. All wars ever fought boil down to two reasons. Grievance means somebody has wronged you, or historically you believe very strongly that I've been wronged or my people have been wronged and we're going to get our revenge. Greed is you see an opportunity, you see an incentive, and you go, this should be easy pickings, I should go for it. Crimea was greed. It was there. It was in and out operation, straightforward, we can get this done. The fact that there was no blowback from Crimea created the space for a narrative of grievance, which means, look, they let us have Crimea back because it was ours to begin with. Now I have the logic of saying, well, because Crimea was ours, Ukraine, parts of Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all of this is mine too. That's one factor. The other factor also is the economy. Last time Russia invaded Ukraine, oil went up to about 120. It topped out. Since then, it's been falling. It hit $20 a barrel when COVID started. It's over 145 right now. There are multiple reasons. What triggered it at this point of time, pinpointing that is frankly next to impossible. But generally speaking, it's either greed or grievance. Depends where you are sitting and how you're looking at this. That's why, depending on who you ask, we might have a different perspective, but it helps to see it from a larger perspective. It's either greed or grievance.
Thank you so much for answering that question. And with that, that concludes our forum for this evening. Let's give our panelists a big round of applause. Thank everybody for coming out, and thank you on the live stream for viewing as well. If you do have any follow-up questions or any further questions that you might ask, I think all the professors would say feel free to email them at your earliest convenience, and they'll be more than happy to answer those questions for you.